Hello, I'm Cora Yoder and I am in the Fat Quarter Shop studio. We just finished making our completed hand quilted pillow top and now I'm going to show you how to bind your pillow top. I like to bind my pillows the same way that I bind my quilts. I like to do it on machine because I just spend a lot of time hand quilting, so I am going to do machine binding to speed up the process just a little bit. And I always like to use a striped binding for my projects. I use a stripe almost always on my quilts, on my pillows, and I always design a stripe into my fabric collections just so I can use that stripe for my projects. This is from the Sugarcreek fabric collection. This is a diagonal stripe, which means you can cut your binding strips straight across the grain of the fabric and you'll have a look that looks like a bias binding, which I'm a fan of because you don't have to cut bias strips. You are going to need two of them. Two binding strips cut at 2 inches. That's one of the things that really I think improves my machine binding anyways, is cutting them at 2 inches. I can snug that binding up tight against the edge of my project. So I have cut 2 strips of binding 2 inches by the width of fabric. A couple other things that I like to use for binding. I use the Clearly Perfect Angles seam guide. And I have this on my machine almost all the time. I'm going to show you guys how I use it. In addition to using it for binding, I like to use it for any time you would have to mark a diagonal line. I never mark any diagonal line, so I do all of my half square triangles, all of my flying geese, everything without marking that line. And I do it by using this product. So I'm going to show you guys that. I use Aurifil 2021 pretty much for all of my piecing, binding, you name it, that's pretty much always on my machine. And I like to have Wonder Clips on hand. I use those for binding. And you're gonna need a scissors. So let's get started. So we are just attaching our binding strips, and this is probably going to be pretty intuitive for how you join your strips, but the difference is I'm using this Clearly Perfect Angle seam guide right here. You can see it's staticked down onto the machine, and this center line right here lines up right with my needle. So what I'm going to do is I line up, I've overlapped my pieces just like you normally would with binding, at 90-degree angles, right sides together. I'm going to lower my sewing machine foot, and right now the point of my binding is lined up with the needle, and then this back point here I want to be lined up right here with this center line. So I'm just going to move him over a little bit, and then all I need to do when I'm sewing is just keep that point lined up with that center line as I sew, and I don't have to mark anything. So I kind of just lift the top of my I had just basted my pillow top in place and I left those stitches too big. So I'm turning that back down to about a 2, and we're just going to start over again. I don't worry. That happens to me sometimes, and I don't worry about taking those stitches out. I just back it off and realign everything and keep going. So I've got my foot back down, my stitches set at about 2, and we're going to try that again. So my first point up there is lined up, and I'm just keeping this back point lined up, and I just kind of flip that top piece of fabric up as I go. But as I get closer, I just let that go back down, keep watching what I'm doing. And you're gonna have a nicely joined piece there, and then you're gonna flip that up. Now, one thing I do wanna mention is when I'm working with striped fabrics, some people get a little bit concerned about how these stripes are gonna run. I don't worry too much if they look like that. That doesn't bother me. You don't notice that once that's sewn onto your quilt top, and I just let it fall how it falls. So I will take this over, trim off the excess fabric here, press it, and away we go. I just finished joining my 2 binding strips together, so now I'm just going to press these. You can trim this off before you press, and I just eyeball this. If you would rather use a rotary cutter and a ruler to get a perfect 1/4 inch, you can do that if you want to. I just trim mine off. And here's another thing. You can press this open or you can press to the side. I generally press to one side, so that's what I'm going to do here. Just press that like so. And like I said, you're going to see how these stripes line up, and that doesn't bother me. But if that was something that you weren't a fan of, how that stripe lines up, you could be a little bit more particular with how you lined your binding strips up. Once this is sewn on, you're not really going to notice that those stripes aren't perfect. And it's something that really only comes up when you're doing bias stripes. If you're ever doing stripes that are just vertical, they always just line up pretty tidy. But that doesn't bother me. If it does you, you can just straighten yours up a little bit more. So now we are going to just press this in half, wrong sides together. And again, I had cut these at 2 inches, so this is probably going to look a little bit narrower than what you're used to working with. And I usually just lay this down the width of my iron, and you can tell I have one that sits like that at home because I just automatically did that. I usually just lay this down the width of my ironing board and just press this whole thing. So I have finished ironing my binding, right sides together, and we're ready to go over to the machine and start sewing this down. So I'm gonna grab my Wonder Clips. Let's head over there. So I have come over to the sewing machine here, and we're gonna start stitching our binding down. I have a 1/4 inch foot on my Juki with a seam guide. I like to sew from the back when I am machine binding, so we're gonna do that. And on small projects, this is going to end up at a 12 inch size. You're gonna wanna give yourself plenty of room between the start and finish of your binding. So I'm gonna start, I have a tail up here, and I'm gonna start down here closer to the corner. I might even tug that up a little more. We're probably gonna need to trim this down once we finish sewing it down, but we'll start with something like that. And I'm gonna come down here closer to the corner. And we'll just start going. So what I like to do is I always backstitch just a little bit here when I start so nothing comes undone. Sometimes I find that I do need to unpick a little bit if I don't have quite enough room when I get around, but I always tack it to start. And then we are going to come here to the edge. Now I always keep a little 2.5 inch ruler beside my sewing machine so that I can take a peek here, and sometimes I'll even mark with a pencil just so I get that 1/4 inch right there. Sometimes you can eyeball it, but sometimes it's nice to mark, so I just double check that, and then I'll keep coming down. You want that to end at a 1/4 inch from your edge here. Once I get there, I backstitch a couple stitches, and I take my project completely out of the sewing machine at this point. Now I know some people will do a continuous seam around a corner, but I like to take mine all the way out, and I pivot my project before I do any flipping of the binding. So right here you can see that I didn't come quite as far as I want to, because you want your binding to line up exactly right when you get to that corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually grab a friction pen that I have here, and I'm gonna mark that just a little bit better so that I get a better idea of where I need to finish. And I'm just gonna add a couple stitches there, just so I can be sure that I'm getting where I wanna be. So I'm just measuring my 1/4 inch there. And we're gonna just take another stitch or two. You probably don't have to be that particular with it. I know I've certainly eyeballed it and been very happy with the results before, but I'm just gonna take just a couple more stitches. So I'm gonna come back up a little bit, back stitch, come up to where I marked, and then we'll do that again. So then take it out, bring it up. Now you can see that lines up much nicer. It hits right in that corner where I want it to. So you flip it up, you flip it down, and you want everything nice and lined up. Now here, I'm going to just sew a couple stitches, and then I'm going to keep going. I usually backstitch up here. I know some people don't backstitch there. The other thing I want to mention too is when I'm doing pillows, I prefer to start on the side that doesn't have this falling on the side. So that way you don't have to fuss with that when you're finishing. All right, so we'll just keep going. For this part, I don't really clip anything, and I just line it up and just go. Get down to the next corner, just make sure everything is lining up nicely. I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to go right ahead and mark my 1/4 inch right away. And again, this is a step that you can sometimes eyeball, but I'm just going to mark it. I just mark it a little bit right there, just so I can see where my 1/4 inch is. And then keep going. And I'll back stitch there. One more. Take it out, flip it around. Make sure he's all nice and tidy. And then keep going. I'll mark again at this corner. I always have one of these little stash and stores beside my machine. It's great for keeping like your marking tools in, your seam ripper. We all know we use those if they're going out of style. So keep those handy. You can even put these little, I put my rulers in there before just to keep them right by. Okay, this is our last corner. And since this is a small project, you're not going to want to sew too far down this side before we join these strips. If you only leave yourself a little bit of room at the start and stop, it's just a lot trickier on a small project to join those strips. So I usually just come in a little bit here. That might be all that I'm going to do here, and then I'm going to take it over to the table and I'm going to trim these ends up. I'm just finished attaching my binding to the back of my pillow top, and now I'm going to show you how to finish attaching our binding. So at this point we have two loose tails here. And as I'm laying this out, I'm noticing that this side is going to be a little long. If I were to leave this all the way over here, it's just going to be trickier to work with over at the machine. So I'm just going to eyeball and chop off maybe, oh, that's like an inch or so. I might actually go a little bit more than that. Try to keep that kind of straight if you can. And if you need to mark that and keep that straight, you can. And then what I do is I bring over the long tail, and whatever the width of your binding is, my binding is 2 inches, that's the number you have to keep in mind. So you bring it over and you're going to just fold right where they meet, and then you're going to measure 2 inches. So I have a little ruler. I'll measure 2 inches over from where that fold is at, and they butt right up against each other, 2 inches over. And then I usually trim back just a little bit less than that, usually about 1/4 inch, because what I find is if I cut it exactly at the 2 inches, if my binding stretches a little bit as I'm doing this last part, I get a little bit of a fold in the binding. So I usually back it off just a little bit. And you can come up, and so really it's going to be at like 1 3/4. So if you would cut your binding at 2.5 inches, you would measure over 2.5 and then back it over a little bit. So you might be looking at 2 1/4. And that's just kind of the rule of thumb for how to trim your binding. So I'm going to come over here, and you'll know, like, if I shove this right up against my ruler, like, it's not going to be quite tucked up against, so I usually just shove the ruler over just a little bit so that I'm getting more what I want. That's kind of a janky cut, so I'm just going to tidy him up just a little bit here. And you can measure this and make it all tidy and delightful. That looks better. Now he's nice and straight. And then I'm just going to take this over to the machine. I like to join my bindings on a diagonal. So we're going to take it over there, and I'm going to show you how I do that at the machine. So the next thing that we need to do here is to attach these two ends of our binding. And we attach them just in the same way that we attach them when we very first started the strips. And sometimes what I'll do with these small projects, like I said before, it can be a little bit tricky to maneuver a diagonal join. So sometimes I will just fold my pillow in half and grab a Wonder Clip and just stick that together so it kind of stays out of my way. And then I've got my two ends together. Okay, so I went and grabbed my pins and I have it pinned in place. I usually try not to pin unless I have to pin, and this was a circumstance where it was just not wanting to lay. So I've pinned them in place. I'm using these magic pins, which are my favorite pin right now. So that's what I have here, and I just have 2 of them just to kind of keep everything in place here. And we're just gonna sew. Now you'll remember when I started, I lined up my point up there with my needle and my back point on my seam guide, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. I have my foot down, my presser foot down, and we're just gonna sew these 2 together. I'm sure some of you fall on the I will not take my pins out before I get there, but I usually like to tug those out before I get there. Sometimes you'll find me racing over them, but I've had sewing machine needles go flying when I do that, so I usually like to take those out so I don't end up with needles shooting around my sewing area. And then you just finish it off here. And then what we'll do is we can unclip this, and then we'll go back over to the table and we're just gonna press that in place, and then it's gonna be ready to finish stitching down to the back side, and then we will be ready to stitch from the front. So I went over to my cutting table and I trimmed off the join to 1/4 inch, and now I have pressed everything in place here. You can see all my raw edges are aligned, and then you're ready just to finish sewing this down from the back. So I just start up a little bit up from where I finished, and I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to come down a little bit more. You don't want to catch that corner when you're doing this. I'm just going to back stitch in place, and then we'll just finish joining this together. Come all the way down to where you started. Whoops. There we go. Maybe. Sometimes this machine gives me a little fuss with that. There we go. And so we have everything attached. And then what we'll do next is we go over, and I like to press everything from the back before I stitch anything from the front. So that's what I'm going to go do now, is give everything a nice tidy press. All right, I have my binding attached to the back of my pillow. I've used a 1/4 inch seam. Everything is completely attached, and the next step that we want to do is just give everything a press. This is going to make everything lay so much nicer as you're stitching from the front. And I like to use a nice hot iron, get in those corners nicely. Steam is going to be fantastic for this step, and you're just pressing it all out from the back side, and this just makes everything lay very nicely once we get around to stitching on the front. So just go around the whole perimeter. I do this for pillows, for quilts, minis, whatever I'm working on gets a nice press from the back before I ever stitch from the front. And make sure you get in those corners there. You want those to come together nicely for you. Just around the whole thing. The nice thing about a small project like this is it doesn't take very long to get around the whole thing. And once you have it all pressed, then you'll go back to the machine, and we're going to be top stitching on the front side, giving it a nice finish. So I'll show you how to do that. All right, so what I have done is I've used just a couple Wonder Clips to hold the binding in place. Because I use 2-inch binding, I'm able to go tight up against the edge of my pillow top, and it's going to fall really nicely back in here just on the outside edge of that binding, which is really nice about using the 2-inch. So I just snug it tight up against, and I like to do just a little top stitch. So with this sewing machine foot here, I can just line up with the inside of that left foot there, that left foot prong, and I'll just line that up here. I generally keep my stitch length at whatever I was using for piecing, so it's set at about 2 right there, and we just top stitch. So I like to back stitch just a little bit to start here, and I tend to go a little bit slower when I'm doing this because you're going to be seeing this from the front, so just keep it lined up with the edge of your foot there. And I like to start in between 2 Wonder Clips. So I'll put one up above where I'm starting and then one right after, and I tuck my foot right in between the 2. And then you just want to I'm just keeping it lined up, the edge of my binding lined up with that inside of the foot there. And when I get down here to this corner, I take that off, and I usually kind of tuck that in there real good. And I want this just to be in a straight line as I come down through. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way up to my original stitches from the back side, and I'm gonna back stitch and end there, and then I'm gonna take everything out, just pivot it and keep going. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm gonna keep coming up here. And we're coming just up to where you can see your seam line up there. You wanna end right where you can see that. And I'm gonna back stitch. And again, some people do this in a continuous line. I find that I like to just take it all the way out of my machine. I usually kind of give that a little bit of a tug up in there. And then if we have measured everything right, when I fold this over, this is gonna line up very nicely right there in that corner. You want that just to make a nice little mitered edge there. And then I will usually put a wonder clip down in here to hold that in place a little bit. Sometimes I'll add a couple more, just to keep everything nice and tidy there. I tend just to use a couple wonder clips at a time. The first time I used wonder clips, I did a quilt and I wonder clipped the whole entire quilt, like a big quilt, before I started binding, and that thing weighed so much. I quickly learned, do not wonder clip your whole project. I don't know, maybe some people prefer that, but I found that that just added a lot of extra weight and clanking as they all hit together. So we're just gonna start right where that meets, and I'm gonna back stitch, and then we're gonna keep going. And again, you're just lining up your foot with the edge of the binding, and you can see it just makes this really nice little stitch across the front. And when we look on the back, we can see right here is where my stitch is running in the back. So it's running just on the inside edge of that binding strip. It wasn't until I started using 2-inch binding that well, the first time I did machine binding I was happy with was piped binding, and I actually will be sharing piped binding in another video, so be sure to check that out. But then the next thing for non-piped binding was switching to using 2-inch. I just think that made such a big difference with how my binding falls on the back. I think that's where a lot of people are unhappy with machine binding, is when it just doesn't look as nice on the back. Hand binding is always so tidy from the back, and then machine binding can go badly if you don't have a good technique in place. So we're just going to continue going around. I'm going to stitch down all of these edges, and then our pillow top will be done. As I get close to the edge here, I like to just back stitch over there again where I started. And that is your finished binding. We're going to take this over to the table. I have a couple more things to share with you, and you'll have a completed project. All right, so I just finished top stitching my binding, and I have just a couple more tips to go over, and you will have your completed hand quilted pillow. Number one, you're going to end up with a lot of little threads if you do your binding the way I did mine, so you're going to want to snip all of those off so it's nice and tidy. The second thing then is going to be your blue lines. from marking your quilt top. At this point in time, this is when I would take those blue lines off, and I usually just use like a really drenched washcloth. I don't spritz, I just really get a washcloth wet and go over top of the whole thing, and the lines will go away. I have tried spritzing it before, or just like a damp paper towel, and I find that that's not generally wet enough, and my blue lines will not be taken away completely. And then I have also found that even if the blue lines come back the first time that it's been washed in a washing machine, I haven't ever had them come back after that. So I think it's really just making sure that you get your project very wet, and then those blue lines are taken away by water. The second thing that I like to mention is you're going to end up with a little binding scraps, and I just save these in a bin in my sewing room, and then eventually you'll have enough to do scrappy binding, and I love doing scrappy binding. So save those, hang on to those come in handy, especially if you oftentimes cut your binding strips all at the same size. Then you can just put those together and end up with scrappy binding. And then I wanted to show you guys the back of the pillow project. I know when I was sewing, I was saying how it was gonna fall. This way you can see where your stitch line falls right on the inside of that binding all the way around. And the reason that it falls so nicely is that 2-inch binding, you can just tighten it right up against. There's no give. Sometimes we have extra movement within our binding when we cut those strips larger. With a 2-inch binding, it just snugs right up against, and then it allows us to be nice and accurate around that outer edge. And so once you have completed your pillow project, you might be ready to move on to something bigger, or maybe you're just going to end up doing another pillow. But I have one of my favorite hand quilted projects that I wanted to share with you. This one is special to me, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit. So this quilt right here is one that my grandma made for me. My 95-year-old grandma gifted it to me just last year, so it's pretty new. And I think as quilters, we oftentimes receive, or we're oftentimes making quilts and things for other people, but I didn't really have my own quilt in my house, and my grandma gave this to me. It's special because her name is Lulu, so my grandma Lulu used my Lulu Lane fabric, which I named after her, and made the quilt top. My mom hand quilted the quilt for me, and I just have to show you this label. So this label, it says everything about this quilt, and I know I'm really bad about labeling things, but my grandma is so good about labeling things. So she says, fabric Lulu Lane by Cora Yoder, made by Grandma Lulu, quilted by Jody, in parentheses mom, just in case I don't know who Jody is, I suppose. And then the date, December 16th, 2017. So she finished it just the end of last year before, and gave it to me the beginning. And it's backed in Minky, and I know we all love Minky on the backs of our quilts when they're machine quilted, but you should feel how they feel when they're on the back of a quilt that has been hand quilted. They're even softer, and I know the Minky backed quilts are always the quilts that my family and I fight over when we're at home. They just always get snatched up before some of the other ones. And the other thing I wanted to talk about on here is the striped binding. I know I said earlier I love a striped binding. This is the stripe that I had in my Lulu Lane fabric line, and I just love the way that it frames it out. And my mom and grandma know that I love a striped binding, and they put that striped binding on there for me. And my mom said she told my grandma, you have to back it in Minky because they love Minky. So it's just the perfect soft quilt. And as quilters, we know and appreciate the time that goes into piecing and then hand quilting a quilt. If you make these projects for yourself or for your friends and family, they just have so much more meaning when they're hand quilted. And so I do hope that you try out hand quilting for yourself.